I knew something was off the second I saw my name misspelled on the termination form. Not just a typo. Cartwright had scratched it out and written it in pen, like he'd already printed too many copies to bother fixing it. Your role is eliminated. Security will escort you out, he said, never even glancing up from his keyboard. I remember thinking, even his voice sounded outsourced, flat, practiced, like someone taught him how to say it in a webinar about assertive offboarding. Meanwhile, the HR rep across the table kept trying not to make eye contact with me, like I was already a ghost, and looking at me too long might summon a liability. That's the part no one tells you about being the backbone of a company. You're invisible until they think they can live without you. For 9 years, I was the unshakable constant. When our vendors went through 2 acquisitions, I rebuilt the license bridge in a weekend. When the entire APAC region went dark due to a failed certificate renewal, I rerouted traffic through a redundant handshake protocol I'd buried in the back end, just in case. Nobody asked how the magic worked. They just expected it to keep working. And it did. Every time. Oh, and before we go further, if you're listening to this and it already feels familiar, maybe you've been the one holding it all together in silence. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like. 97% of people listen but don't follow, and it genuinely helps the team keep bringing these stories to life. All right, back to Verticore. The irony was, Neil couldn't even tell you what my actual title meant. Senior Systems Compliance Strategist sounded like a mouthful to someone who thought governance lived in a Notion doc. He came in waving Gartner reports like they were sacred scrolls, raving about agile transformation, and hired 3 PMs who couldn't spell SFTP if you spotted them the S and the F. He wanted dashboards, metrics, pretty colors that moved. What he didn't want? Legacy systems, redundancies, the weird, complicated web of controls that didn't fit into his weekly stand-ups. I didn't resist. Let him think I was just another line item. I sat in the back during his first all hands and watched him botch our core partner names, misquote our service guarantees, and use encryption and firewall interchangeably. I didn't say a word. You learn not to when you've survived 4 CTOs, 3 reorgs, and a 6-month stretch where the only thing keeping our product online was a duct-taped SSL tunnel I spun up on a retired dev box. Neil didn't ask about the license server because he didn't know it existed. Or rather, he thought it was internal. He didn't know that 5 years ago, when legal balked at how much our vendors were charging for renewals, I built a workaround. I registered a holding company, Kairos Holdings LLC, poured the license controller through it, wrapped it in a private escrow agreement, let Verticore lease it back under a renewable governance clause. It was cleaner that way, more secure, legally separate, yet functionally invisible, unless you knew what to look for, which no one ever did. They just approved the renewal paperwork every quarter and patted themselves on the back for staying lean. So when Neil fired me, when he checked that little off-board access box without reading a single clause in the licensing schedule, he wasn't cutting fat. He was pulling the plug out of the wall. And the fuse had been buried in legalese so thick you'd need a week and a flashlight to find it. I didn't say a word in that meeting, didn't fight it, didn't panic. I just looked him in the eye, smiled like I was saying goodbye to a waiter who brought the wrong drink, and said, "Let's make sure we do this properly." Then I stood up, turned, and walked past the 2 security guards waiting outside like I wasn't the one holding the kill switch to every system they still thought they controlled. The glass walls made everything colder. You could see the whole floor from that conference room, rows of standing desks, ring lights clamped to cheap monitors, plants someone forgot to water. Neil sat across from me with the kind of practiced detachment you only learn from YouTube videos titled "Delivering Hard News with Executive Presence." He folded his hands like he'd rehearsed the line in the mirror. "We're flattening structure, eliminating redundant legacy roles." I didn't flinch. Redundant. He barely looked up from the org chart, just rotated the iPad toward me like he was showing me a pie chart of my own obsolescence. "Your responsibilities will be absorbed by a centralized team in Singapore. It's a time zone advantage, really. More agile." Then he pressed something on his screen. "Security will escort you out today. Standard exit protocol." That was the part that got me. Protocol. Like this was all clean, precise. He had no idea. Neil thought I was a terminal node, easy to cut without killing the circuit. But I'd written the circuit. He had no idea that the compliance engine I built didn't just govern how our systems talk to each other. It defined how Verticore talked to the world, how we passed audits, how we licensed outbound service integrations to over 30 major partners. He didn't know what Schedule A was. He'd never had to. But I had. I wrote it. The first time was 6 years ago, in the middle of a chaotic licensing migration when we almost lost our DoD contract because some VP forgot to check the vendor license expiration clause. I fixed it by building our own controller, wrapped it under a private entity, quietly routed our handshake certificates through a cloud-based compliance vault licensed by Kairos Holdings. No big fanfare, just clean, reliable control. And then I filed a governance trigger clause, Section 4.7a. Any involuntary removal of a role directly tied to the IP license structure, as recorded in Schedule A, shall trigger a stakeholder review within 48 hours. It passed. Quietly. No one read it. But I remembered. And I never updated the license structure out of the holding entity. Every quarter, they just rubber stamped the renewal because it said, no material changes to contract. And Neil? He was too new to know that when you remove the woman holding 61% of the license controller's stakeholder vote, you don't just fire her, you light a fuse. That night, I poured myself a glass of bourbon, opened the archive drive I kept mirrored in cold storage, and pulled up the original governance charter. There it was, Schedule A, my name as lead signatory under Kairos Holdings, the IP hash ID, the core server footprint, the signature chain, all of it, and the clause, still active, still binding, and now activated. By noon the next day, I'd routed a digital notice through our shareholder communication channel. Trigger clause declared, emergency board session required. Attached, license revocation risk statement, audit hold status, and a compliance overview that showed, in meticulous, undeniable terms, that my role wasn't just strategic, it was structural. They cut me thinking I was optional. They never thought to ask what happened if I walked with the license, because when they erased my name from the system, they forgot it was carved into the foundation. They had 48 hours. The clock had already started. The intern they sent to box my office didn't know what to say. He kept glancing at the frame certificate on the wall, the one the founder gave me years ago after I pulled off a 3-week compliance overhaul that saved the company $4.2 million in audit penalties. To the one who sees the wires before they spark, it read. I caught him reading it sideways, like he knew it meant something but didn't have the context. Most of them didn't. I let him take it. Let them pack up my legacy like it fit between staplers and HR pamphlets. The badge deactivated mid-swipe at the elevator, a little red blink, like a smug digital shrug. So I waited for security to catch up, stood there holding my laptop bag like any other laid-off cog in the wheel. You good? One of them asked. Not cruel, just routine. I nodded. Just want to send one last file. That okay? He shrugged. You've got 5 minutes. 5 minutes was all I needed. I opened my laptop, not the company one, my personal system, the one I never connected to the Verticore network, the one that lived on a private subnet and never left the house unless I knew a reckoning was on the horizon. Pulled up a folder labeled Insurance. Inside, original license agreements, notarized operating docs for Kairos Holdings, and the digital twin of Schedule A, signed, sealed, and 5 years old. I forwarded it to one address, legal.notices@verticoresystems.com. Subject, Operational Governance Charter, triggered notification attached. No explanation, no farewell message, just the fuse, delivered politely, precisely, and on the record. Then I shut the laptop, tucked it under my arm, and turned to the guard. We can go now. They walked me past my old desk like I was radioactive. People turned, pretending not to look. Some of the newer hires probably thought I'd been escorted out for cause. Maybe a security breach, a policy violation, something juicy enough to whisper about in Slack channels and text threads later. Let them think it. Let them talk. The longer they focused on gossip, the less they'd see the trap door yawning open beneath them. I stepped into the elevator and turned just before the doors closed. Neil was standing near the kitchen, half in conversation, holding one of those protein shakes he always pretended he liked. He saw me, raised an eyebrow like he was expecting a scene. I smiled. Let's make sure we do this properly. I said, just loud enough for him to hear. Then the doors closed. Letting them believe it was over wasn't just satisfying, it was strategic. You can't stop what you don't know is moving. And while they boxed my desk and deleted my credentials, the board countdown was already live. The operational fuse had been tripped. Schedule A was in motion. Compliance flags would trigger within the hour. Legal would need to review the clause. And someone would eventually ask the question no one in that room had the answer to. Who the hell still controls the license? I didn't slam a door. I didn't throw a fit. I just left the building like a woman done with small talk, while the walls they thought were stable started quietly shifting under their feet. It hit around 7:13 the next morning. Quietly, of course, the way all real disasters begin, not with a siren, but a calendar alert. Legal had run a routine cross-check prepping for Q4 partner renewals when someone, probably an intern or first-year associate, opened the licensing folder labeled Legacy Exceptions and noticed something weird. The license controller wasn't attributed to Verticore, not in the signature metadata, not in the control logs, not anywhere. The license they'd been renewing like clockwork for the past 5 years legally belonged to someone else. The entity listed on the escrow certificate was Kairos Holdings LLC. That someone else? Me. At first, it was probably dismissed as an outdated placeholder, some expired structure someone forgot to revise. But then they opened the file trail and the timestamps told a different story. Kairos had never lapsed. Its control signatures matched every single quarter's compliance renewal, every handshake, every validation key, every outbound API call to our highest-paying partners, all routed through infrastructure leased from an entity owned and operated by the woman they'd walked out under fluorescent lights and passive-aggressive nods less than 24 hours earlier. The panic didn't start with yelling. It started with silence. Legal didn't escalate immediately. They never do. They confirmed. Double-checked. Quietly asked IT for a system audit. Checked licensing paths. Searched for any override clause. None. And then they found the governance charter. Section 4.7a. In the event of involuntary removal of any role identified in Schedule A as directly tied to the company's operational compliance infrastructure, a mandatory stakeholder review must be initiated within 48 hours. Schedule A hadn't been updated, which meant the clause was still active, which meant the countdown wasn't just real, it was legally binding, which meant they were already 16 hours into it. At 7:49 a.m., someone in legal forwarded the clause up the chain with a 2-word subject line, immediate risk. At 8:12 a.m., the general counsel added the CEO and chair to the chain. At 8:19 a.m., Neil replied, "We were told that clause was obsolete." At 8:20 a.m., the reply came back, "It's not, and she holds 61% of the controlling vote through Kairos." At 8:21 a.m., Neil stopped responding. I didn't need to see the emails to know this was the timeline. I knew exactly how it would unfold. Bureaucracy always follows a rhythm when it realizes it's been outmaneuvered. Denial, delay, discovery, then dread. By 10:30 a.m., executive assistants were quietly clearing blocks on the board's calendars. By 11:00, a new event appeared in the executive suite's shared Outlook. Emergency Stakeholder Assembly, required attendance. It was real. It was happening. And for the first time, my name wasn't in the CC line as a courtesy. It was listed as the host. That's when the discomfort really began, not just for Neil, but for the entire leadership tier that had smiled and nodded and let someone walk out the door without asking what she actually controlled. They thought I was a footnote. But it turns out, when you control the charter, the license, and the quorum trigger, you're not a footnote. You're the author. And the chapter they just turned, it had my name on it, in ink they can't erase. Neil called 3 times before noon. I didn't answer. His number was saved under Salt Packet in my phone, a joke I made during his first week when he proudly announced he was going to season the team with new energy. He left a voicemail that started stiff. "Hey, I just wanted to check in," then slid awkwardly into bargaining. "If you're open to a conversation, maybe we could discuss a consulting role. No hard feelings." I didn't have hard feelings. I had leverage. HR emailed next, some polite flailing about ensuring proper documentation of transition tasks. Cute. They still thought this was about knowledge transfer. Then came legal. seeking clarification regarding any active governance entitlements tied to your prior position. The email was timestamped 12:06 p.m. The emergency clause had already been active for over 28 hours by then. Too late. Everything they could have done to mitigate this had an expiration window, and it closed the second they walked me out without due process review. That was the brilliance of the clause. They couldn't unfire me without invalidating their own governance integrity. Trying to reverse it would call into question every other termination since charter ratification. They couldn't backpedal without unraveling the whole structure. And by now, I wasn't asking for re-entry. I had already moved on. At 1:22 p.m., the invite dropped into every senior executive's calendar. All VPs, legal, CEO, compliance, finance, ops, even the outside counsel that advised the board on public filings. The subject line was dry, surgical. Emergency Stakeholder Assembly, Governance Compliance Trigger, RMART Section 4.7a. The body had no preamble, just an agenda. Acknowledgement of active stakeholder quorum per schedule. A review of license authority and associated operational dependencies. Proposal for continuity structure and resolution framework. Temporary reassignment of decision rights for impacted systems. At the bottom, one name. Host, Jonathan Wren. Title, Majority Holder, Kairos Holdings, LLC. That's what I'd named the entity when I formed it. My father's middle name was Jonathan. Wren came from a poem my mother used to recite, about the smallest bird carrying the longest song. No one at Verticore ever bothered to ask what it meant. They just approved the paperwork and pushed it through finance. Now, Jonathan Wren was the largest single voting authority in the room, and I was the only one holding that proxy. They had scrubbed my badge, my email, my employee ID, but you can't delete a voting block from the charter. You can't unwrite control, and you can't host a board-level stakeholder meeting without the one person who now outranked the org chart entirely. The irony? All I had to do was check a box. RSVP. Yes. Attendance confirmed. Because I wasn't walking back in as a compliance strategist. I was walking in as the majority stakeholder of the backbone they forgot to trace, and every system they thought they owned, still humming on infrastructure that quietly belonged to me. They thought they'd hit bedrock, but they hadn't even found the bones. The deeper they dug into the licensing structure, the uglier it got, at least from their perspective. It wasn't just about the core IP license anymore. It never was. The moment legal pulled the certificate chain, they saw it. Kairos Holdings didn't just own the handshake rights to our internal license controller. It also held the escrow certificate for the entire security platform we'd been selling as military-grade compliant since 2019. I remember setting that up. We were facing possible suspension from a Tier 2 defense supplier list because of an expired upstream encryption cert. Everyone panicked. I didn't. I negotiated with the escrow authority directly, built an isolated compliance tunnel, and set the entire thing up under Kairos, because no one else could guarantee separation of liability if Verticore were ever acquired or breached. That structure saved the company, and now it trapped them, because terminating my role didn't just activate Section 4.7a. It triggered Clause 7.4 as well. Automatic licensing integrity review required upon any material disruption to the ownership, control, or oversight of licensed infrastructure or its designated custodians. Material disruption. Designated custodian. Me. And since no one redelegated control, since they never bothered to update Schedule A or submit a transfer of authority, the system treated the termination as an unauthorized structural breach. That meant every contract dependent on that platform was now technically out of compliance. Everyone. Our highest tier partners, the ones with security thresholds, chain of custody requirements, or regulatory checks, they'd all require revalidation. Some of those audits took months. Some wouldn't wait a week. And at the very top of that list, a $30 million quarterly renewal with the Department of Defense. A contract that explicitly referenced compliant continuity of licensed platforms and key custodial agents. Language I helped write. At 2:42 p.m., the compliance officer on our DoD account flagged a red marker in our system, escalating the clause violation to legal and the executive suite. The subject line was short. Custodial certificate out of sync. Immediate action required. The PDF attached contained a screenshot. Karis Holdings still listed as primary. My digital signature, dated, encrypted, verifiable. Verticor's name was nowhere. They'd built everything on a foundation they didn't own, and now the earth was shaking. The irony? I wasn't blocking anything. I hadn't revoked access. I hadn't disabled a single function. All I'd done was quietly leave. But systems don't lie, and compliance doesn't care about your intentions. In the fine print, control doesn't look like shouting. It looks like the name on the certificate when federal auditors ask who holds the keys. Neil had spent weeks parroting efficiency metrics and cost rationalization. He used phrases like lean ops and scalable automation. But now he was staring down a legal briefing with words like indemnity and breach exposure and pending revocation, and none of those came with a toggle switch in a SaaS dashboard. By evening, the general counsel had cleared her schedule. The board had been looped into a new private thread, and IT had quietly requested a copy of the last 3 years of license architecture logs. But none of it could be undone, because while they were tracing the wires backward, trying to find the source of power, all they kept finding was me. The message was only 1 sentence long. No attachments, no explanation, no signature flourish. Just a line I'd rehearsed in my head as I watched the 48-hour mark inch closer. Subject: requesting updated proxy access ahead of board meeting. Body: kindly confirm assignment credentials for stakeholder quorum registration. I hit send, and then I waited, not out of anxiety, out of necessity, because I knew how long it would take for the chair's assistant to escalate it. I knew who had access to the governance override dashboard. I knew that once that message hit their inbox, the rest of the House of Cards would straighten its tie and start whispering. I didn't hear back from Neil, not HR, not legal. The reply came directly from the chair of the board, 14 minutes later. Noted. Calendar updated. Room reserved. That was it. No scrambling language, no corporate fluff, no performative regret, just quiet acknowledgement. The kind that only comes when a room full of executives realizes they don't have the votes to stop what's coming, and they're not even holding the gavel anymore. That one line confirmed everything. That I wasn't showing up as a guest. That I wasn't being invited as a courtesy observer. That I didn't need a badge or a passcode or a red-carpeted boardroom, because I was already inside. Legally, structurally, immovably. I could picture the conversations happening behind closed doors. What do we offer her to make this go away? Can we reinstate her role? Call it a misunderstanding? Would she even come back? But they were asking the wrong questions. Because I didn't want my job back. I didn't want a seat at Neil's table. I wanted the table reset, under new terms, with new legs, and without the people who thought they could delete leverage by revoking an email address. My silence wasn't tactical anymore. It was structural. They hadn't just overlooked me. They'd built their entire Q1 operational dependency on a platform tied to a license, tied to a clause, tied to my name. And now that name was on the board agenda as majority stakeholder, Karis Holdings control proxy, active voting block, 61%. I didn't need to demand an apology. I didn't need to threaten litigation. I just asked for my proxy access. And the chair's reply told me everything I needed to know. They weren't preparing to challenge me. They were preparing to listen. You could feel the tension before you even saw it. The hallway outside the boardroom had that pin drop quiet, the kind that usually precedes lawsuits or layoffs. Assistants pretended to scroll. A legal advisor stood half-turned, like she couldn't decide whether to wait or run. And through the frosted glass, I could make out silhouettes, tight shoulders, stiff collars, too many people in a room that was never supposed to get this full unless someone was leaving in handcuffs or out the back door. I opened the door and stepped in. Silence hit like static. The usual boardroom pleasantries never came. No welcome back, no thanks for joining. They all knew this wasn't that kind of meeting. This wasn't a reunion. It was a reckoning. Neil sat near the end of the table, not his usual spot. He looked like he hadn't slept. Tie loosened, just enough to signal panic in slow motion. His gaze flicked up, met mine for half a second, then dropped. I wasn't surprised. People like him know how to bluff across an all hands, but not across actual power. The chair gestured silently to the seat at the head of the table. I took it. No protest, no questions, no motion to defer, just a quiet shuffling of papers, a few blinking laptops, and a legal assistant logging the minutes as if everything wasn't already burned into the room's memory. Meeting of record, the chair began, her voice clipped. Section 4.7a, quorum is confirmed. Voting thresholds met. Representation acknowledged under Kairos Holdings majority block. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew whose vote now carried the room. The agenda appeared on the wall behind me, projected through the system I once helped spec, before Neil outsourced half the dev team to cut costs. First item. 1. Governance clause breach, review of procedural integrity. The legal counsel looked around the table. Before we proceed, can anyone here clarify the justification for terminating a named stakeholder role listed in Schedule A without triggering operational continuity review? Silence. Tight. Swallow hard silence. The kind that happens when no one wants to say, "We didn't know she mattered that much," but everyone knows that's the truth. I didn't say a word. I let it sit. Let the heat rise in their collars. Let the weight of the moment press down on the shoulders that used to nod along to Neil's optimization plans and headcount simplification. He tried to speak once, half cleared his throat, but legal raised a hand before he could even finish exhaling. We're in governance review. You'll have opportunity to speak once factual record is acknowledged. Translation: you're not in control here, not anymore. That's the thing about silence. When wielded at the right moment, it doesn't sound like weakness. It sounds like authority. I sat back, folded my hands, and let them work through it. Every slide, every clause, every missing notification, until the final document appeared. Schedule A, 5 years old, signed, time-stamped, notarized, with my name, my title, my custodial authority. It had never been amended, which meant, by charter, my removal wasn't just a procedural failure, it was an operational breach, and the man who triggered it was now a guest in the room I controlled. The reversal wasn't loud, it didn't need to be, because once you sit at the head of the table, you don't raise your voice, you don't argue, you just look at the room that forgot you mattered, and wait for them to remember. It landed like a paperweight, dry, factual, utterly damning. 3 weeks after the boardroom reckoning, Verticor's 8K filing went live to the public. Tucked beneath earnings forecasts and sanitized language about strategic adjustments sat the real headline. Statement on recent shift in board leadership and licensing control. No names, no finger pointing, just a subtle acknowledgement that the structure had changed. Behind the scenes, it was more dramatic. My shares, held quietly through Kairos, remained untouched. Legally, they couldn't claw them back without risking shareholder litigation, and they knew it. So instead, they paid my severance in full, plus the quarterly retention bonus I'd technically triggered the day they terminated me. A formal letter followed. Not from Neil. From the chair. On behalf of Verticor's board, we regret the procedural oversight surrounding your recent exit. We recognize the foundational role you played in securing our operational compliance infrastructure. Your contributions are now embedded in updated policy. Thank you for your continued integrity. I read it twice, then tucked it away in a drawer. I wasn't interested in apologies. I was interested in precedent, because now, every termination at Verticor, at any level touching licensing, compliance, or custodial systems, requires a full clause review signed by legal, board liaison, and the operational risk officer. Mandatory, documented, auditable. My legacy, in policy form. Neil, of course, resigned to pursue new opportunities. No public statement, no send-off post, just a quiet removal from the company directory and a LinkedIn update that read like it had been ghostwritten by shame itself. The people who used to crowd his Slack huddles now left his name off recaps entirely. They didn't talk about me either. Not openly. But in meeting minutes, my clauses were quoted. In new hire onboarding, my governance diagram was required reading. And in one quiet corner of the compliance wiki, under escrow ownership exceptions, was a single sentence added by the new counsel. Do not underestimate the strategic value of a name buried in an appendix. I never raised my voice, never sent a threat, never asked for my rollback. I just showed up, with control, with documentation, and with the patience of someone who didn't need validation to know where the real power lived. The role they eliminated became the one that couldn't be ignored, and the silence they mistook for weakness turned out to be the loudest voice in the room.